Hello, welcome to Presume Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 69 of C# tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss making method parameters optional by specifying parameter defaults. Please watch part 67 and 68 before proceeding with this video. In part 67, we discussed using parameter arrays, and in part 68, we discussed method overloading. In this video, we'll discuss making method parameters optional by specifying parameter defaults. We'll be using the same example that we used in part 67 and 68. Let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have this add numbers function, which is going to allow the user to add two or more numbers. Okay, in this function at the moment, the first and second number parameters are going to contain the first two numbers that the end user want to add. And in case if he wants to add more than two numbers, then those numbers will be passed as part of this third parameter here. Now look at what we are doing. The implementation is very straightforward. We have an integer variable here, result, which is holding the sum of the first and second numbers. And then look at this. Here we are checking if rest of numbers is not null. Okay, if it's not null, this rest of numbers, if it's not null, then we know for sure the end user wants to add more than two numbers. Okay, in which case we are looping through that integer array, taking each integer out of the array and adding it to this result variable. Finally, we are printing the sum. Okay, pretty straightforward. At the moment, if you look at this function, all the three parameters are mandatory. Now let's say, for example, if I want to add just two numbers, when I say 10, 20, and then if I try to build a solution, look at this, I already have a red squiggly there. It says no overload for method add numbers take two arguments, because the only overloaded version of add numbers at the moment has three parameters, and we need to supply values for all the three parameters. Okay, now my intention here is to make this third parameter optional, and that too I want to make it optional by specifying a default parameter value. And how do we do that? All you need to do is equal to, and you can specify whatever value you want to specify. At the moment I'm going to specify a value of null. Okay, so look at this. Right now that error has gone away. Now here the end user wants to add just two numbers, in which case he is not going to supply the argument for the third parameter. So if we don't supply an argument for the third parameter, then rest of numbers will be null, in which case it wouldn't go through this for each loop, because this condition will become false. Okay, so obviously now if I go ahead and run this, as you might expect, the sum will be 30. Okay, on the other hand, if the end user wants to add more than two numbers, then he can pass a value for the third parameter as well. Look at that. By default it's null, but I want to add two more numbers, maybe 30 and 40. So I am creating a new integer array and then passing those values 30 and 40. And obviously if I run this now, we should get the sum of those four numbers. Okay, so in this video we have discussed how to make method parameters optional by specifying parameter defaults. But then one thing to keep in mind is that the optional parameters must appear after all the required parameters. So here the first number and second number are mandatory and required parameters, meaning you have to supply values for these parameters. Okay, but then the third parameter is the optional here. Now the optional parameters must appear after all the required parameters. Now what will happen if I specify this as the second parameter? Let's look at that. Look at this. If I try to build this, let's comment this method call right there, and let's try to build this and see what's going to happen. So right click on the project, build. Look at that, it says build fail, and look at the error message. Optional parameters must appear after all required parameters. Okay, alright. Another thing that we'll discuss here is named parameters. Now let me actually, to speed things up, I have this method already implemented, so let me copy that and let's flip to Visual Studio. Now if you look at this function here, the test function, it has got three parameters here, and out of these three parameters, A is mandatory, it's a required parameter, and then B and C are optional because we have default specified there. And all this function does is it prints out the values of whatever we pass in. A is equal to A, B and C. Okay, now look at this. Let me invoke this function. Okay, so test, and then I'm going to pass a value of 1 and 2. Okay, look at that. I can just invoke this function by passing just 1, because B has a default value of 10, C has a default value of 20. Now let me run this. So A will be 1, B will be 10, and C will be 20. Okay, now let's say I want to pass the second parameter as well, the argument for the second parameter. Let's say I want to pass 2. Now my intention here is to actually pass this argument 2 as the value for the third parameter. Now let me actually run this. So by default, what's going to happen? 1 will be treated as the argument for parameter A, 2 will be treated as the argument for parameter B. But my intention is I want to pass 2 to parameter C, and I don't want to supply any argument for B. I want it to use its default. Is it possible? Absolutely. That's where named parameters come into play. So now I want this number 2 to be treated as an argument for parameter C. So how do I specify that? That's my intention. I can use named parameters. Look at this. The moment I press comma after the first parameter, you know look at the IntelliSense. It's asking me to supply a value for parameter B. But what I can do, I can specify the name of the parameter here. The name of the third parameter is C. So I'm simply going to say C. Look at the IntelliSense again. It's showing that syntax as well for us. C colon and then 2. And look at what happened in the IntelliSense. Okay, it has recognized that we want to pass this value to C. So now obviously if I run this, as you might expect, B is using its default value, whereas 2 is now passed as the argument for the third parameter. Okay. In our next video, we'll discuss making method parameters optional by using optional attribute that's present in system.runtime.interop services. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.